All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're continuing our positional reviews where we're looking at the Falcons tight end position, talking quite a bit about how, despite Kyle Pitts having an outstanding rookie season, it still feels like he's only scratching the surface of his NFL potential.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, writing weekly content for the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons. And of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And before we get into today's tight end year-end positional review, where we'll be talking about Kyle Pitts, Hayden Hurst, Lee Smith, Parker Hesse, Jaden Graham, and what's next for the Falcons at this tight end position, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. And of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, you can also check out Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a like when you do. So today we're going to start off talking quite a bit about Kyle Pitts. And I want to give a disclaimer at the top because it's going to sound like more that I'm talking about what Kyle Pitts wasn't as a rookie season, as far as he had. And the reason why I'm doing that is not to be negative towards Kyle Pitts, but it does sort of feel like there was some meat left on the bone. The analogy I would use, it's like it's going to an expensive high-end steakhouse and you get that tomahawk ribeye steak that's the bulk of why you pay 50, 60, whatever you pay for that meal, and the steak is delicious and you come out of there thinking, man, this is one of the 5 best steaks I've ever had. That's basically what Kyle Pitts' rookie season is. But you also, as part of that meal, you get like 2 sides of mashed potatoes and I don't know, asparagus, and the mashed potatoes are just okay, and the asparagus is undercooked or overcooked or not seasoned properly or whatever the case may be. And part of you also sits here and goes, man, that could have been an even better meal had the sides lived up to the potential. But that the main reason why you went to the steakhouse was to get that delicious steak, and that's where, like, objectively, Kyle Pitts had a historically great rookie season. That he's the sort of steak in this analogy, where he finished with over 1,000 yards, just 51 yards shy of breaking Mike Ditka's rookie year tight end record for yardage. He set back in 1960. It's a testament to how great Kyle Pitts was. He probably could have broken it had he not been injured in that season finale against the Saints. And so I think it's definitely true that Kyle Pitts was absolutely outstanding. It's objectively true that he had a great rookie season, but yet we still have that lingering feeling. I'm sure many of you, myself, has that lingering feeling where it's like, was there some meat left on the bone? Was there some potential for this season to be even better? And part of that, people will talk about the fact that he only had 1 touchdown this season, despite all those yards. And we'll circle back to sort of that red zone conversation. But you kind of look at Kyle Pitts' season and you look at it and you break it down. And you're like, 75% of his yards, over 75% of his yards came in like 9 games this year. In those 9 games, he averaged 87 yards per game. He averaged 5 catches on 7 targets in those games. So he was basically averaging over 17 and a half yards per reception, 12 yards per target. Those would be, at the top, if not top 1, but top 3 in the NFL at all wide receiver positions. He was catching like 75% of his targets in those games. Again, something that is elite among the receiving position, whether we're talking about tight ends or whatever the case may be. But then you kind of look at the other 8 games he had this year where he was averaging 3 catches on 6 targets for 30 yards, 10 yards per reception, 5 yards per target, which is numbers on par with players like Robbie Anderson or Jalen Rieger, 2 wide receivers that were considered major disappointments this past season. And I don't point that out as a knock against Pitts to say, oh, like he was great in half the season and terrible in the other half of the season, but it does sort of speak to the notion that it felt like for large chunks of the season, particularly early in the season, it felt like there was more opportunities to get Kyle Pitts more involved. And I've heard from your feedback and comments that you guys have made to me over the course of the season, where it always felt like, even though Kyle Pitts sort of, again, objectively is playing at a high level, particularly compared to other players, it does feel like he could be playing at an even higher level. And one does wonder in some of those games where Kyle Pitts wasn't necessarily putting up monster production, again, averaging 3 catches a game. And going back to yesterday's episode where we talked about the wide receiver position, that's production on par with what you would typically expect out of a pretty typical number 3 wide receiver in the NFL. And half of Kyle Pitts' season projects like that. And it feels like, could he have gotten more opportunities in those games? And it's similar to the conversation that you heard people talking about the Dallas Cowboys post their playoff game, where CeeDee Lamb was relatively quiet in that game, and people were criticizing their play caller and Kellen Moore about not being able to get him involved, getting their best weapon, more of those manufactured targets in that game. And I think that's kind of a fair critique of Arthur Smith. Why did it take until week 17 for the Falcons to attempt their first tight end screen to Kyle Pitts this past season, as a testament to potentially opportunities to get Kyle Pitts some easy targets and let him, create after the catch. And then you can look at sort of the lack of red zone production from Kyle Pitts. And we're not going to take a deeper look at that on today's episode. I think maybe I'll save that for potentially later this week, where we can do a full breakdown of Kyle Pitts and the rest of the Falcons red zone offense. But, essentially what it boils down to, I'll give you a spoiler on what we're going to be talking about with Kyle Pitts specifically, is you can certainly criticize Pitts that he had some opportunities to win at the catch point, and he didn't consistently do that this year on some of these lob plays. But it also felt like Arthur Smith was very basic in designing, some of these plays that were basically lobs to Kyle Pitts, and that just didn't feel like he was really doing a great job holding up his end of the bargain as the play caller to really put Kyle Pitts in advantageous situations. But that's where we'll circle back to being a little bit more positive rather than focusing on the lacking, some of that meat on the bone. Let's finish up talking our conversation about Kyle Pitts being a little bit more positive. And one of those is sort of looking at the parallels between Kyle Pitts' rookie season and Julio Jones's rookie season, where similarly to Kyle Pitts, Julio in his rookie season, coming in with those high expectations, also kind of most of his production came in a handful of games, a half dozen or 6 or 7 games that rookie season. And then the other half of the season that he was healthy for, wasn't necessarily putting up monster production each and every week. And of course, we know Julio Jones was able to build upon that very shortly thereafter, going into year 2 and playing at a Hall of Fame level in subsequent years. And I think Pitts will also improve going into his second year, and time will tell if he's going to play at a Hall of Fame level. But I think that potential is definitely there. And speaking of that, that's kind of part of the issue surrounding Kyle Pitts, is it feels like there's unfair standards surrounding him, where he's kind of expected to be this Hall of Famer, and part of that is owed to the parallels between himself and Julio Jones. The fact that he's, being essentially in year 1 expected to fill the Julio Jones size hole in the Falcons offense, following immediately on the footsteps of Julio Jones in this Falcons offense. They were both sort of similarly generational talents that were expected to transform and or carry the Falcons offense. And, you compare their rookie seasons that were very similar, and, it makes for some obvious and sometimes lazy comparisons. And then you couple that with how highly they were drafted at the time. And we're not going to get into the conversation surrounding Kyle Pitts' draft standard, but essentially all it means is Kyle Pitts' expectations for him are extremely high. And I just basically illustrated that by spending 8 minutes talking about, why he had a great season, but yet, it still feels like he could be even greater. And so essentially it boils down to, we just had a great meal at the steakhouse, a great steak, but we came out of the restaurant complaining about the mashed potatoes and the asparagus rather than focusing on the steak. And I just basically fell into that same trap, and I will probably continue to fall into that same trap from time to time. And so basically I'm saying to you guys, if you also find yourself falling into that trap, that's, some, those are some of the reasons why. It's just, you can't help but think about the potential and the Hall of Fame and all these various things, and it's not really fair to Kyle Pitts. But we will try as much as we can to be fair of Kyle Pitts, particularly when we're talking about, those side dishes or whatever the case may be. And speaking of those side dishes, we'll get into the sort of the equivalent of the side dishes at the tight end position by talking about some of the backups like Lee Smith, Hayden Hurst, Parker Hesse, and more as we continue today's year-end positional breakdown for this tight end group on Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, again, I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, today I'm plugging the Locked On Hawks podcast, where host Brad Rowland is giving you the lowdown every single day on the Atlanta Hawks in their NBA season. So go check out the Locked On Hawks podcast on the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. So we're talking about dining out in expensive steakhouses, and of course you're going to need money for that. Why not earn some by heading over to betonline.ag, which remains the number one spot for all your sports wagering action this calendar year in 2022. You can sign up today and use the promo code Locked On when you do, so that you can receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. And you can use that welcome bonus to bet on the upcoming conference championship games, where the Chiefs are 7-point favorites over the Bengals. The Rams are 3.5-point favorites over the 49ers, despite the fact that they've lost 6 straight games against the 49ers. They're begging for you to throw money on the 49ers, but you know where my loyalties lie. Unfortunately, my 3-team parlay did not come through. Shout out to you, Aaron Rodgers, for letting me down on that front. And of course, the overtime rules let me down on my Bills bet, but it's neither here nor there. Whether you want to bet on football, basketball, hockey, boxing, UFC, all the way to your favorite Vegas casino games, BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports. So don't wait and take advantage of all the amazing offers available at BetOnline, where the game starts. So when we talk about the Falcons backup tight ends, let's start by talking about Hayden Hurst. And regular listeners of the podcast sort of have heard me say this before. And similarly to, feeling like Arthur Smith let down Kyle Pitts in a number of ways, it feels like Arthur Smith let down Hayden Hurst in a lot more ways. And so when we talk about leaving meat on the bone, Hayden Hurst really does seem to epitomize that. And so you kind of have this balance where, again, even though I can sit here and nitpick Arthur Smith in his usage of Kyle Pitts, particularly when it comes to the red zone, for the most part, it's evidence. Again, objectively, Kyle Pitts had a great rookie season, so you got to give Arthur Smith credit for that. But then you kind of balance that out, or at least somewhat, tip the scales away from that when you look at how he utilized Hayden Hurst, which was primarily as a blocking tight end. If you look at the first 7 weeks of the season, when we had a healthy Calvin Ridley, or at least a playing Calvin Ridley, before he stepped aside due to his mental health, about 40% of Hayden Hurst's blocking snaps, he was asked to be a blocker, according to PFF. And that compares to last year, where it was less than 30%, obviously, when he was primarily the pass catcher and starter at that tight end position. And then what's interesting is from week 8 onward. So once Calvin Ridley stepped aside and took a break from football to deal with his mental health, you would assume that, okay, the Falcons have some lacking issues at the wide receiver position, so they're going to need Hayden Hurst to be more involved in the passing game to help fill that Calvin Ridley-sized hole in their offense. Well, guess what? Hayden Hurst went from 40% of his snaps being used as a blocker when Ridley was out there to 50% of his snaps being used as a blocker when Ridley was not out there. And so that doesn't really make sense, and that's the crux of some of my criticism when we talk about Arthur Smith and whether or not he was getting the most out of the talent here in Atlanta. In some cases, again, like Kyle Pitts, he was getting not all the talent, but he was getting most of it out. And then in Hayden Hurst, it only felt like he was not even coming close to that. And so why take a guy that's a subpar blocker and a at least above average pass catcher, if not better, and ask him to block more and catch less. It doesn't really make sense in that scenario that the Falcons found themselves in, lacking some of the weapons at the wide receiver position. And you go back to Hayden Hurst's time in Baltimore, where one of the big reasons why he fell out of favor in Baltimore was because he was being asked to block as much and he wasn't necessarily carrying his weight in that regard. And his usage in Atlanta kind of was comparable in terms of, 45-50% of his snaps being used as a blocker in Baltimore's very heavy run system. So now that Hayden Hurst's 2021 is done, it doesn't look like he's going to be returning in 2022 now that he's an impending free agent. I won't say the chances of his return are zero, but I would sit here and bet that they're probably in the single digits in terms of a percentage chance that he does return this upcoming season, just because I feel like the Falcons completely misutilize him. And of course, Hayden Hurst is probably going to flee for greener pastures to go to an offense where his pass catching abilities will be better utilized. Now, a player that the Falcons did get a decent amount of production from a pass catcher, at least on a very limited basis, was the third tight end. That's Lee Smith. Of course, primarily Lee Smith's role in this offense was to block. About 86% of his snaps he was used as a blocker, and he did a pretty good job there. He wasn't perfect by any means, but for the most part, he did a really solid job and showcased why he's been one of the best blocking tight ends in the league for over a decade. When you look at all the tight ends that played at least 100 blocking snaps, so 100 of their offensive snaps came as blockers, and 60% of their overall offensive snaps came as blockers. If you look at that group of tight ends, that would be a relatively fair cutoff, in my opinion, to basically say, okay, those are the guys that are considered quote unquote blocking tight ends. Those guys that's over 60% of their snaps come as blockers. Lee Smith was 11th ranked, according to Pro Football Focus, as a run blocker among tight ends this year. Now, what's funny is when you look at that list, another name jumps out to you, not a current Falcon, but a former Falcon that was fourth on that list, and that's none other than Eric Saubert, the former Falcons player that landed in Denver this past year, where, of course, none other than the spectacular Wade Harman is the Broncos tight ends coach. And longtime listeners know I only bring that up because several years ago, when Wade Harman moved on from Atlanta, a listener asked me a question about, who are the best assistant coaches on the team. And I said, I don't really know if this coaching staff is chock full. And this was roughly prior to the time where most fans were turning on this coaching staff. So I was an innovator and an icon when it came to that. But basically what I said was like, oh, the only coach I know is good at his job is Wade Harman. Then like 2 weeks later, the Falcons did not renew his contract. And I was like, of course. Right. So, that just kind of speaks to that. And so the fact that Wade Harman was able to turn Eric Saubert, a player that was not necessarily known for his blocking prowess, into an effective blocker this past year in Denver, sort of speaks to Wade Harman again, strikes again to prove, take from like 2-3 years ago that he's, one of the few good coaches, position coaches on this roster. But Lee Smith, like Hayden Hurst, getting back to the subject at hand, is an impending free agent. And the expectation, at least based off of Kyle Pitts' social media post from a couple of weeks ago, is that he will retire. And so if that's the case, we say kudos to Lee Smith for doing a good job this year. And despite my initial criticism of that acquisition, back in February last year, certainly I think Lee Smith deserves a lot of praise from myself. I apologize, Lee, for being critical of that move. You certainly outperformed my expectations this year and proved why you've carved out in an 11-year career as one of the top blocking tight ends in the NFL, and a rare player that has truly made an entire career and a very effective career being primarily used as a blocker. You can kind of look at another guy like Mercedes Lewis, who has carved out a nice niche as a blocking tight end, but for the first decade or so of Mercedes Lewis's career, he was primarily a receiver with the Jaguars, and only in the last 5 or so years with the Packers has been asked to be a blocking tight end. So if the Falcons do lose both Hurst and Smith this offseason, that does open up 2 potential voids in terms of their tight end depth. And rather than automatically assuming that they're going to go outside the organization to fill those this offseason, they do have have some potential in-house options. That includes Jaden Graham and Parker Hesse. Let's talk about Jaden Graham. He's kind of a forgotten man, given that he spent this entire season on injured reserve with a knee injury. But we saw Jaden Graham a couple of years ago in Atlanta seem like a guy that was suited to fill a Hayden Hurst type of role in this offense, as a guy that can give you production both as a blocker and as a pass catcher. In that 2019 season, he was one of Pro Football Focus's higher graded run blockers that year, and also flashed that effective skill set stepping in for an injured Austin Hooper as a pass catcher, and showing a level of athleticism that I think is very comparable to what Hayden Hurst brings to the table. And of course, he was not able to build off of that in the ensuing year in 2020, where his blocking was generally poor, and then he also had little impact in the passing game. And so I feel like there's still that potential, that untapped potential with Jaden Graham to be that two-way player, and that's been something that we have talked about on this podcast since that 2019 breakout season, where he was one of the more improved players on the Falcons roster back then, and he has yet to fulfill that over the last 2 years, and obviously most recently due to injury. So I feel like the opportunity and the potential is still there, but I'm not convinced that this new regime is going to give him the same opportunity that the previous regime tried to give him. He is going to be a restricted free agent this offseason, and more than likely I would guess that the team will not tender him as a restricted free agent and thus allow him to hit the market as an unrestricted free agent. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's as good as gone in the same way that we look at guys like Hayden Hurst and Lee Smith due to retirement. They could potentially re-sign him on a sort of veteran minimum contract. You see that constantly with teams as a way to sort of save money from tendering restricted free agents. So maybe he could be brought back to compete in camp, and we'll just sort of have to see about that. But I'm not necessarily overly optimistic that that will be the outcome, but it's certainly a possibility. As for Parker Hesse, he seems ideally suited to fill that Lee Smith size hole in the offense as a primarily a blocking tight end. So if we were to lower our threshold from 100 snaps, blocking snaps, to 72, which is what Hesse had this past year, and instead of 60 of his offensive snaps being used as a blocker, just 58, again, to allow Hesse to qualify, he would have ranked as the 8th best run blocking tight end in the NFL this past season. And that was the thing that always stood out to me in the few opportunities that Hesse had to play this year. He always seemed to stand out as a blocker on film. And so I think that TE3 role that Lee Smith filled, where he's asked mostly to block rather than pass catch, I think Hesse is well suited for that role. And while he's not nearly as good an athlete as Graham, and therefore I don't necessarily see him being as ideally suited to fill that TE2 role that Hayden Hurst fills, where you do want a guy, even though, I sat here and complained about Hurst not getting as many opportunities as I think he should have, still 50 to 60% of the time he was asked, to be more of a pass catcher. And I don't necessarily know if that's where Hesse's bread will be buttered. So I don't think that makes really sense for him. But as a third option, I think he makes a ton of sense. So between him and Graham, I would certainly bet that Hesse is part of the team's plans moving forward, given how well he played as a blocker to potentially fill that third tight end spot. But we'll talk about what the team's plans are this offseason as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, and talk about some of the potential free agent targets that you could see the Falcons targeting at this tight end position as we continue today's episode. But before we get there, guys, I want to let you know that Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson, the hosts of the Peacock and Williamson NFL show, are hitting the road as they are headed to LA next month for Super Week to get all the great coverage that they will provide then, as well as now, in all the games and NFL storylines leading up to the big game. Subscribe to the Peacock and Williamson podcast on whatever this podcast that you're currently listening to today's Locked On Falcons podcast on. So speaking of hitting the road, traveling means that you're going to have to pay for gas, and we know that that can be expensive, but not anymore. With a new app called GetUpside, you can get cash back and save every time you fill up, because every time you fill up with GetUpside, you get 25 cents back per gallon, and there's no catch. It's all free. You can download it for free in the App Store or on Google Play. All you got to do is open the app, go to any of the eligible gas stations near you. There are thousands of locations all over the place. You claim the offer, you fill up, and they put money into your account and you can cash out anytime with direct payments into your bank account, PayPal, or do like me and get them on Amazon gift cards. And now when you open an account and use our special promo code touchdown, you get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon on your first fill up. That's up to 50 cents back per gallon. Don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free GetUpside app and use our promo code touchdown when you sign up. That's GetUpside, promo code touchdown, to start saving every time you fill up. So, as I said earlier, I'm very high on Kyle Pitts' potential at this position. But the real questions surrounding this offseason at the tight end position is going to be about how the Falcons fill sort of some of these depth roles. As I said earlier, the potential is high that the Falcons lose their two primary backup tight ends. And again, while I think Jaden Graham has the potential to fill one of those spots, I doubt that the team is going to necessarily feel the same way and necessarily give him that opportunity. I think they're more than likely going to bring in somebody to fill that second tight end spot and probably pencil in Hesse as the third tight end. And maybe they bring back a guy like Jaden Graham into camp. Obviously, the Falcons also signed a guy from the CFL and Braden Lenius, who's a sort of a big bodied receiver, 230, 240 pounds, that could also be in the mix and give the team some value as a pass catcher off the bench. But obviously, based off of the way that the Falcons utilized the tight ends this past year, it does seem like Arthur Smith wants more blocking ability than necessarily pass catching ability. So one does wonder where sort of Lenius fits into the mix, but we'll just sort of have to see. Maybe he could be sort of a CFL gym, sort of waiting in the wings, a diamond in the rough, so to speak, that we could see develop into a pretty decent role player for this team moving forward. But in terms of filling the depth roles, we're probably looking at the draft, we're probably looking at free agency, and whether or not the Falcons target potential backup tight ends that can bring more value as a blocker in either one of those avenues remains to be seen. I haven't necessarily done my full homework on this tight end draft class, but from what I've heard and what I've read from various folks, it seems to suggest that it's a pretty deep draft class. It's not great at the top of the draft, but in those middle rounds, those late rounds, you'll be able to find some decent talent there. So I think that's certainly a possibility and an avenue for the Falcons, particularly on day 3 of the draft, where it does feel like there's a high probability sitting here today that they could pull the trigger on a tight end. But part of the reason why I haven't done my homework on that tight end draft class and probably won't do it until much later this offseason is because I'm kind of waiting until March to see what the Falcons do in free agency and whether or not they address their potential tight end needs there. And so therefore, if they do that, then I can probably skip, really taking a deep dive on this tight end class, and that will allow me to take a deeper dive at other positions of need. You got to be very mindful of how you spend your time. As much as I grind that film each and every day, guys, you don't have endless amount of hours in the day. But I think when you look at some of the free agent options, there's a lot of potential pieces that the Falcons could target, and I think a lot depends on sort of how much the Falcons value this potential role in their offense. And are they willing to spend money in free agency, or will they sort of look for more cheaper options like they kind of did last year with Lee Smith or whatever the case may be? Because you have some potential options that may be a little bit more on the expensive side. You have quote unquote, failed starters like David Njoku and OJ Howard, some 2 high round draft picks that do have a little bit more blocking ability than Hayden Hurst, but also offer some potential as pass catchers to be more of that dual threat tight end than Hayden Hurst was able to fulfill this past year. Another guy that has been a very productive tight end in a very similar role is Mo Alley Cox with the Colts, has been sort of their number 2 tight end there and bringing value as both a pass catcher and run blocker in that regard. And he doesn't necessarily have that former first round pedigree that guys like Njoku and Howard have, but has certainly turned himself into a very solid number 2 tight end these past couple of years. Could the Falcons target some guys that Arthur Smith is familiar with from his Tennessee days? You have 3 impending free agents that were tight ends under Arthur Smith there: Anthony Ferkser, Michael Pruitt, and Jeff Swaim. Ferkser is more of a pass catcher than a blocker, so you wonder about that fit, but Michael Pruitt and Swaim certainly specialize as blockers these last couple of years. And so could you potentially lure one of those guys for cheaper than potentially you would have to pay for an Njoku or a Howard? And there's plenty of other options, other names like Max Williams is out there as a guy that has performed performed as a very capable number 2 tight end that has blocking ability from his days in Baltimore. That's now currently with the Cardinals, could be also an option. So there are plenty of other names that we could go through, and maybe at a later date we might go through some of those potential targets. So it's curious to see if the Falcons do wind up pursuing one of those guys, and what that does to their draft plans at the tight end position. If they do go out there and sign a free agent in March, and it probably pushes tight end to the back burner, potentially as a late round flyer type of thing, where it's truly a best player available in like round 5, 6, or 7, where it's like, hey, this guy, we had a 4th round grade on this guy and he fell to round 6. Let's take a flyer on him or something like that. And one does wonder sort of how big a priority tight end is going to be, given some of the other skill positions on offense, where it does seem like the Falcons have a little bit more of a pressing need, whether that's running back or wide receiver. But in a world where the Falcons are successfully able to retain Cordero Patterson or Mike Davis or Russell Gage or Calvin Ridley this offseason, then maybe that allows tight end to move up the totem pole in terms of potential priorities. Again, I don't necessarily know if the Falcons are going to super prioritize that position, but if we're sitting there and we're saying, okay, our top 2 running backs, our top 2 receivers are back, and basically now we just need to find that second tight end to back up Kyle Pitts and be more of that inline guy, that could be something that you could see as a 3rd or 4th round target that could take precedent over some other positions of need that we sort of stare at right now and say, okay, that's a more pressing issue. Again, because the Falcons may look at a BPA type of strategy and feel like, one of these tight ends in this, again, allegedly relatively deep tight end class could outshine some of the players at maybe some other more priority positions. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to see unfold. Again, right now I don't have answers, just more questions at this point in time, but I do think the tight end depth is going to be something that the Falcons do address, whether it's in March or whether it's in April. That I do think that's a position where the Falcons are going to look for some viable backup options here at the position, because I do think we know that Arthur Smith loves his tight ends, and they got to mention Felipe Franks. Again, technically Felipe Franks could be in the mix at this tight end position to potentially fill those Hayden Hurst shoes. I don't think the Falcons are going to necessarily pencil that in, but given, the presence of guys like Jaden Graham and Parker Hesse and Braden Lenius and Felipe Franks, as well as, the guys that we picked up on the practice squad, John Rainey and whoever else, the Falcons could have a lot of competition for some of these backup spots. And maybe that means that the Falcons will go cheap at the position and hope that through the power of competition, one or more of these guys will emerge rather than necessarily spending the money in March or spending the draft capital in April. So that's also a possibility. But I do sit here today right now and think that if all things are equal, the Falcons will find a potential tight end at some point in March or April to help, supplement their depth. So we'll just sort of see how that goes, guys. In tomorrow's episode, I still have to reach out to confirm this, but hopefully we'll have a guest on. And if we don't, then that will allow us probably to do that red zone breakdown. If not, then we'll just save the red zone breakdown for Thursday, and then potentially Friday, we should be able to get into the offensive line. So that should be the plan for the rest of the week. I hope you guys appreciate, what we did on this year-end breakdown, and we got many more to come in the coming days and weeks. And of course, if you want to provide your feedback to anything I discussed on today's episode, if you like the steakhouse analogy or you hate it, let me know. Hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel to let me know, if I was right on my steakhouse analogy when it comes to Kyle Pitts' rookie season or not, or whatever the case may be. So definitely do that. And of course, the other thing you should do is listen to the Locked On Bets podcast, in addition to all the local shows like Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, and Locked On Bulldogs. Of course, Locked On Bets is free and available on all the same platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. And of course, Lee Sterling, the handicapping expert of Paramount Sports, is giving you the lowdown each and every day with daily picks, blowout specials, and of course Lee's lock of the day. So check out the Locked On Bets podcast, available on Apple, Odyssey, Google, or Spotify. So guys, that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. I appreciate it. Till then.